Hello, this is James Keene at Binary Mechanics Lab, your one-stop depot for reverse engineering the universe and the latest advances in particle physics. The fundamental physics constant doctrine hides the failure of popular physical theories, including legacy quantum mechanics and both special and general relativity. The so-called fundamental constants are in fact the greatest body of unexplained data in physics. Really, how could that be? The doctrine acts to obscure the now obvious fact that these unexplained observations comprise basic unsolved mysteries in physics. Instead of addressing these basic questions, the doctrine teaches that these observations are essentially a sort of no-go zone for theoretical physicists. First, these observations are typically confined to a short Appendix A in physics books, wrongly labeled fundamental constants. Second, the natural units in basic equations help hide the fact that the measured values of these constants remains unexplained, although these values are used as input parameters. Third, accepted interrelations or dependencies among these constants indicate mathematically that they contain redundant information and could not be fundamental. Finally, binary mechanics is thus far the only comprehensive physical theory to derive the values of the so-called fundamental constants from first principles. Here we have in Figure 1 the greatest body of unexplained data in physics. Woohoo! Sold by obedient physicists as fundamental inputs, required by incomplete, flawed physical theory. It says Appendix A, fundamental physics constant. When you have the glasses off, with multi-millions in research funding, the scientists appear very authoritative. The greatest body of unexplained observations in physics is the so-called fundamental constant. So Appendix A should say, most important unexplained data in physics, light speed, Planck's constant, and so forth. News alert! Binary Mechanics Lab published first ever derivations of basic physical constants from first principles. Now we have idols in a sacred temple. The fundamental constants doctrine, advocated in the physics community, consists of a dogma and propaganda, misdirecting attention away from endeavors that we call science and physics. The axiom synonym might suggest that these so-called constants might be treated as givens or assumptions, like idols in a sacred temple, outside the purview of physics research. Never mind that they are a major body of unexplained measurements, which would normally be the object of intense investigation to discover a credible theoretical basis for their observed values. Here's some definitions and synonyms for doctrine. A supposed special status for many of the so-called fundamental constants has been reinforced by descriptions such as universal constants, universal in nature, immutable, and non-derivable from more fundamental principles. Workers remove the light speed idol from the temple. Light speed measurements are said to date back to the 17th century. However, prior to binary mechanics, there was no account of why vacuum light speed was approximately 30,000 kilometers per second instead of some other measured value, say 10,000 or 90,000, or how about just 30 kilometers per second, without reference to other unexplained constants. Expression of light speed as a function of other unexplained constants does not qualify as a derivation of the measured value from first principles. We'll see more about that in just a moment. Hence, the first ever true derivation of light velocity from first principles of quantum theory was a historic achievement. In short, one of the non-derivable idols in the fundamental constants temple crumbled. Here we have where we're going. The primary physics constants will refer back to this in a moment. Workers move new physics into the temple. What if a supposed constant is not really constant? Some believe that discovery of such variability would imply new physics. Two of several examples might be mentioned. First, Figure 4 shows results of a 2016 study where light speed depends upon vacuum energy density, which added important amendments to Einstein's postulate of constant vacuum light speed. Note that Einstein did the best that anyone could at the time, without knowledge of vacuum composition and quantization of space, time, and energy. How could he do more than what he did do without that knowledge? Second, according to a binary mechanics study, a proposed measure value of the fine structure constant alpha was also shown to depend upon vacuum energy density. Listing vacuum light speed as a constant may be appropriate in some contexts. The problem arises when the adjective fundamental is added, since we now know that light speed is a secondary constant, not a fundamental or primary constant in physics. Similarly, Planck's constant h is a proportionality constant relating energy to electromagnetic radiation frequency. E equals Planck's constant h times the frequency f. Since the first ever derivation of Planck's constant from first principles and the classic expression of angular momentum in 2015, it too is now categorized as a secondary, not fundamental constant. Whoops, there goes another temple idol. That was from the great song High Hopes. Now, figure 3 shown above lists other secondary constants, which may also be seen as predictions. Poof, let's hide the idols. Natural units is the practice of setting all universal physical constants to 1 in physics equations. There are a number of ways in which natural units may be defined. This practice may have merit in simplifying key equations. On the other hand, equations in natural units where the so-called fundamental constants do not explicitly appear may tend to deflect attention from the unexplained status of the hidden constants. When all else fails, do the math. Many theorists claim to derive one or more of the so-called fundamental constants. The essential question is, are their calculations based only on first principles? Or are they using some unexplained so-called fundamental constants to calculate others? The latter possibility would not be truly new ground, since interrelationships among these unexplained measures, the so-called fundamental constants, have been a fixture in physics literature for decades. For example, with vacuum permittivity normalized, one may write fine structure constant alpha is equal to elementary charge squared divided by 2 times Planck's constant times the vacuum speed of light in equation 1. With simple algebra, one can rearrange equation 1 to express any value in terms of the others. Clearly, there is redundant information or dependency among the values in equation 1. There is not even one physical constant in the equation that does not depend upon the other values. Mathematically, equation 1 is equivalent to several perhaps somewhat shocking statements. First, the so-called fundamental constants in the equation are not fundamental. Second, these constants could not be fundamental. That is what equation 1 says. Some form of equation 1 appears in almost every book on particle and atomic physics, yet the author does not recall even one presentation where its meaning was clearly understood. Look up the expression for electron magnetic dipole moment, which includes electron rest mass in the parade of redundant information where so-called fundamental constants are clearly not independent values. The presence of redundant information means that the so-called fundamental constants must be based on a set of values which are invariant and independent of each other. This set of values was discovered as reviewed above and presented as the primary constants of physics. Point, set, match.